More chapters from Sideways Stories of Wayside School. Chapter 7, Calvin. Calvin had a big, round face. Calvin, said Mrs. Jules, can you take this note to Mrs. Arvis for me? Mrs. Arvis? Asked Calvin. Yes, Mrs. Arvis, said Mrs. Jules. You know where she is, don't you? Yes, said Calvin. She's on the 19th story. That's right, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules. Here, take it to her. Calvin didn't move. Well, what are you waiting for? Asked Mrs. Jules. She's on the 19th story, said Calvin. Yes, we've already established that fact, said Mrs. Jules. The 19th story, said Calvin. Yes, Calvin, the 19th story, said Mrs. Jules. Now take it to her before I get frustrated. But Mrs. Jules, said Calvin. Now, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules, unless you would rather go home early on the kindergarten bus, said Mrs. Jules. Yes, ma'am, said Calvin, and he slowly walked out the door. Laughed Terence. Take it to the 19th floor. Give it to Miss Arvis, hooted Myron. Have fun on the 19th floor, called Jason. Calvin stood outside the door to the classroom, and he didn't know where to go. Now, as you know, the builder at Wayside School, he accidentally built it sideways, but he also forgot to build the 19th floor. He built the 18th story, he built the 20th story, no 19th. He said he was very sorry. But there was also no Mrs. Arvis. Mrs. Arvis taught the class on the 19th story. Since there's no 19th story, there's no Mrs. Arvis. And besides that, as if Calvin didn't have enough problems, there was no note. Mrs. Jules had never given it to Calvin. Oh, boy, this is great, said Calvin. Just great. I'm supposed to take a note that I don't have to a teacher who doesn't exist, who teaches on a story that they never built. He didn't know what to do. He walked down to the 18th story and then back up to the 20th story, then back down to the 18th story, back up to the 20th story. There was no 19th story. There never was a 19th story. There never will be a 19th story. Calvin walked down to the administration office. He decided he would put it in Mrs. Arvis's mailbox. But there wasn't one of those either. But that didn't bother Calvin much since he didn't have a note. He looked outside the window and he saw Louis, the yard teacher, shooting baskets. Louis will know what to do, he thought, and Calvin went outside. Hey, Louis, Calvin called. Hi, Calvin, said Louis, and he tossed him the basketball. Calvin dribbled it and took a shot, but he missed it, and then Louis tipped it in. Do you want to play a game? Asked Louis. I don't have time, said Calvin. I have to deliver a note to Mrs. Arvis up on the 19th story. Why are you all the way down here? Asked Louis. There's no 19th story, said Calvin. Well, then where's Mrs. Arvis? Asked Louis. There is no Mrs. Arvis, said Calvin. Well, then what you gonna do with the note? Asked Louis. There is no note, said Calvin. I understand, said Louis. Well, that's good, said Calvin, because I sure don't. It's very simple, said Louis. You're not supposed to deliver no notes to no teachers. You already haven't done it. Calvin still didn't understand. I'll just have to tell Mrs. Jules I couldn't deliver the note, he said. That's good, said Louis. The truth is always the best. Besides, I don't think I understood what I said either. Calvin walked back up the 30 flights of stairs to Mrs. Jewls' class. "Thank you very much, Calvin," said Mrs. Jewls. Calvin said, "But Mrs. Jewls interrupted him. "That was a very important note, and I'm glad I was able to count on you." "Yeah, but you see," said Calvin. "You delivered the note to Mrs. Jarvis on the 19th story," asked Jason. "How did you do it?" "What do you mean, how did he do it?" asked Mrs. Jewls. "He gave the note to Mrs. Jarvis. Some people, Jason, are responsible." "But you see, Mrs. Jewls," said Calvin. "The note was very important," said Mrs. Jewls. "I told Mrs. Jarvis not to meet me for lunch today." "Don't worry," said Calvin. "She won't." "Good," said Miss Jewls. "I have a coffee can full of Tootsie Roll Pops on my desk. You may help yourself to one for being such a good messenger." "Thanks," said Calvin. But really, it was nothing. End of chapter 7.